As Oscar Wilde once said, everything in moderation, including moderation. And I think what Wilde meant by that was that James O'Brien is a bit of a melt. James O'Brien is like the thinking man's Jeremy Kyle.
Danny, if you had a brain cell, it would die of loneliness.
Why are you being so rude?
Because I think you deserve it.
In fact, politics in general is to most people, whether they realise it or not, really just the Jeremy Kyle show, but with a dress code.
It's the most ridiculous infantile pile of trash I've ever had to deal with in 11 years. Is this Great Britain today, is it? Right, it's true. Actually, I'm not even going to offer you a bloody lie detector. It's a joke. You're as dodgy as hell. You could have done a lie detector about some fake Facebook account I don't even understand, but you didn't. It's all just drama, isn't it? Why don't you just get on with your own lies?
So James O'Brien, who has made a career out of trolling leavers on the phone, went viral the other week when a mild-mannered and seemingly well-informed member of the public made the mistake of ringing O'Brien up and professing to being a socialist, for which of course he was subjected to a torrent of abuse.
That could have been a speech made by Jeremy Corbyn with sincerity. There's no sincerity in it.
Right.
It was just he thought what people wants to hear.
Right.
There's no sincerity at all.
Okay.
And I'm a lifelong socialist, and I wouldn't vote for him.
No. Well, there's a surprise, Ian.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I bet he had a really open mind before he started speaking.
Well, all he's done is attack
Sarcasm
members
emoji.
of the Labour Party.
Yeah, all right, mate. Have a great day. Yeah, let's keep on fighting among each other, Ian, because that will really stick it to the Tories. Am I right or am I right, brother?
That's what he's been doing.
Come on, comrade, let's keep fighting. Let's go after him, because that will really teach Boris Johnson a lesson. Come on, comrade Ian, tell me again how awful Keir Starmer is.
Or maybe it was the fact that he had the audacity to mention Labour's former leader.
Down with Labour, says our pocket socialist Ian, mate. Good luck. Should we do a quick rousing chorus of the red flag before you jog on?
Either way, Starmer's lack of sincerity is a serious issue, and simply dismissing it isn't going to help anyone.
Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner are conducting themselves as if Corbyn can simply be treated as a pariah, as if they were not part of a Corbyn project for years in terms of serving in shadow cabinet positions. That is the kind of insincerity which was everything that was wrong with politics, everything that people hated, which produced so many ructions in the political landscape, so many rebellions against the established order from the left, from the right, over years in the period after the financial crisis.
But this is the classic super moderate position, and O'Brien is a super mod.
Super mod, super mod, super moderate.
By which I mean he is someone who thinks he believes in progressive political change through democratic channels, but who has actually been hoodwinked into a deeply conservative position in which he sees any substantive political programme as somehow reactionary, somehow dangerous, seemingly more dangerous than this never-ending episode of the Chuckle Brothers that we seem to be living in. See the glaze that washes over them at the thought of anything except exactly what is happening in front of their faces being possible. Starmer can't criticise Johnson because he'd be seen as hampering our coronavirus response. That's just how it is. Yeah, that is literally how it is. That is what's happening. That is a description of what's happening. But that's not the full range of possibilities in the universe. Take America, for example, where the Democrats successfully lumped all the problems of the virus on Donald Trump. Or take France, where Marine Le Pen is doing scarily well in the polls.
Well, he could have pulled up the government on points without being opportunistic.
Right, an example of that?
Well, example is with the terrible treatment of businesses who were stiffed by insurers over business insurance.
And how can he, with 4 years until he gets into government, use that as a political leverage?
He could have publicised it.
Right.
He could be.
How do you know about it?
Transport workers.
How do you know about it?
How do I know about it? Because I've been following the story in the financial press.
So it's been publicised?
He hasn't stood up and championed the small guy against the big guy.
Well, we listen to
socialism.
We listen to completely. Yay! Down with Labour, says our pocket socialist Ian, mate. Good luck.
O'Brien seems to believe, or at least wants to believe, that the massive split in the Labour Party at the moment is down to Labour members not giving Starmer a chance, even though obviously many Corbyn supporters voted for Starmer in the leadership election. Imagine if a year into his leadership, Corbyn had overseen the suspension of his main leadership rival Andy Burnham, and removed the whip from former leader Ed Miliband. Imagine if Corbyn had begun intervening in CLP meetings, suspending members, including CLP secretaries, shutting down debate and overseeing elections. And at the same time, James O'Brien doesn't in fact disagree with a lot of what is being said. Earlier this month he was interviewed by Owen Jones, who asked him about Brexit and the increasing consensus amongst Remainers that the People's Vote campaign was a bit of a misstep.
Given what the alternative could possibly be, I would, if I'd been a Labour MP, I would have voted for Theresa May's second time around on the deal, because by then I thought that if this doesn't go through, then you're going to get the Vote Leave cabal moving into Downing Street.
It's easy in hindsight to say, well, we should have went with May's deal. But who were the people arguing against this position? Who were the people that were trying to shift the conversation towards a people's vote with absolutely no evidence that this was popular in the country as a whole, and with no idea how a second referendum would do anything but polarise the country further? Who are you going to blame for Labour's disastrous Brexit position? Well, you've got to blame Corbyn, right? At the end of the day, Corbyn was the leader. It was his fault. Has Corbyn been punished for that? Yeah, pretty much. Of course, there were many other people involved, but most of them were part of Corbyn's shadow cabinet and are not in the cabinet anymore, so they're not really of any relevance. But there's one person, Labour's shadow Brexit secretary, Keir Starmer, who is now the leader of the party. What part did he have to play? Well, other than Corbyn, the most significant part.
It's right that Parliament has the first say, but if we need to break the impasse, our options must include campaigning for a public vote, and nobody is ruling out Remain as an option.
It was Keir Starmer who came up with Labour's 6 tests. And here's what Alistair Campbell, Keir Starmer fanboy, had to say about those tests in May 2018. As a hardcore Remainer who believes that if you believe something will damage the country, you should seek to prevent it, I welcomed the Starmer tests precisely because I could see no way they would be met, and therefore no way Labour could support the Brexit put before Parliament. Add a reasonably sized Tory rebellion to a Labour whip against a deal that failed to pass the tests, then the government is defeated, crisis ensues, and who knows, it may suit May and Parliament to put the deal to a people's vote. Well, whoop-de-doo.
I would have voted for Theresa May's second time around on the deal.
It's really funny how Remainers, they can see quite clearly that the Brexit voters were being manipulated, that many of the key Brexit figures in government and in the press, they didn't really believe in all this independence rhetoric. Yeah, we were going to take back control. The country was going to be stronger because we wouldn't be tied to EU regulation. We would have control over our borders. They knew that this was all ridiculous, this was all spin, that really the people that were pushing Brexit at the very top, they were just using it to form a base so they could win an election, or for their own business interests, to establish free ports, things like that. They realised this was politics, this is how the game was played. But when it came to the Remainer camp, to what they believed in that case, the people's vote, the people running that campaign, Keir Starmer, all the older Labour establishment that undermined the 2017 election and then had just miraculously appeared and created this people's vote movement. They didn't have a vendetta against Corbyn or anything. They were just really, really big fans of the EU. No political game playing on the people's vote side. No, of course not. It just so happened that the People's Vote campaign built up momentum until there was a general election at the end of 2019, at which point obviously Labour lost massively due to the massive groundswell of support for Remain, for a second referendum that had pushed Labour into a ridiculous Brexit position. And then, once that election was over, suddenly the People's Vote campaign disappeared. Well, it was a massive victory for the Tory party, so therefore we're going to have Brexit. We're going to have the hardest of Brexit. So there's nothing Keir Starmer can do about that. Now, there's nothing anyone can do. Brexit's over now. It's finished.
So my message to Boris Johnson is get on with it and actually focus on what most people are talking about this morning, which is how on earth do we defeat and deal with this pandemic?
So let's track the remainiacs' position from 2016 up till now. And as we go along, just have a think about whether there was perhaps a little bit of manipulation going on here. So in 2016, the UK voted to leave the EU. It was close, but the country voted to leave. People were shocked. Even many leavers were shocked. But after a while, people came to terms with it. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe we could decide what Brexit would mean as we go along. After all, Brexit doesn't really mean anything anyway, does it? And as it turned out, Brexit was actually much more of a problem for the Tory backbenchers than for Labour's. So in 2017, May called a general election, thinking everyone hates Corbyn. But despite the resignations, the coups and the smears, people didn't actually hate Jeremy Corbyn, and Labour did surprisingly well, running on a platform of we'll block the Tories' lousy deal and have our own sensible Labour deal. But then the People's Vote gang turned up and started talking about how everyone was lied to during the referendum, and the campaign was funded by dark money. How any kind of Brexit is going to be really, really bad for the country. Maybe nobody even wants Brexit anymore. But the People's Vote campaign was also lying, and also being funded by dark money. All the polls showed that a Remain abetting position would split Labour's vote, which would in turn ensure a Tory Brexit. But this didn't matter, because Brexit is too goddamn important, alright? It's the future of this country, come on. Some MPs even left Labour and started their own party, which no one cared about. But despite that, there was definitely a huge organic support for a second vote. Honestly. Just as the right-wing newspapers had pumped out story after story about the EU being the cause of all Britain's problems, the liberal press started pumping out editorials by supermods reverberating in their echo chamber that honestly everyone was sick of Brexit. So sick of Brexit that they bizarrely wanted to prolong the agony by having a second vote, which would surely do nothing to heal the divide. Eventually, Labour members were convinced by this and backed the People's Vote, virtually guaranteeing heavy losses in any future election. The People's Vote campaign then suddenly collapsed into nothing just as Labour was forced into an election, which the Tories then won in a landslide. But somehow this had nothing to do with Brexit and everything to do with Jeremy Corbyn's left-wing agenda. But also, actually, it was him personally as well. So Labour needed to completely destroy his reputation, leadership and policies. But also, despite the election being about Corbyn and not Labour's Brexit position, it was also the end of the Brexit debate because people clearly wanted to leave with a hard Brexit and completely rejected Labour's position. But it's okay for the new leader of the party to be a key component of that Brexit position because remember, the problem in the last election was Corbyn, not Brexit. Keep up, Sonny Jim. Were people lied to in the 2019 election just as they had been in the referendum? Yep. Was there a mandate for a hard Brexit? Nope. But suddenly, to now question any aspect of Brexit would obviously be so damaging to Labour's electoral chances in 4 years that Starmer shouldn't touch the topic with a barge pole and should just support Johnson's position on everything. That's just obvious, right? It's obvious. Now. For many in the liberal press, and many on the right of the Labour Party, it seems a referendum on whether or not the UK should stay or leave Europe was not a legitimate way to decide whether the UK should stay or leave Europe. But an election 4 years later that totally destroyed Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, well, that's the end of the debate. We're leaving Europe, no ifs, no buts. What's the big deal with Brexit anyway? Come on, let's move on with our lives.
Get on with it.
Labour's handling of Brexit was disastrous for the Labour Party, for Remainers, for Jeremy Corbyn. It wasn't a disaster for Keir Starmer, though.
But I did listen with some incredulity to what the leader of the opposition said. He said he wanted a better deal. He had the opportunity in early 2019 when there was the opportunity of a better deal on the table and he voted against it. So I will take no lectures from the leader of the opposition on this deal.
When Theresa May feels the need to call out his dishonesty, it makes me think maybe this guy really does have what it takes to be Prime Minister. O'Brien goes on to say,
and I think oddly, because as you know, I'm not a massive fan of Jeremy Corbyn, but I think that failure lies before the referendum was even called. I think Ed Miliband's failure to really have a crack at least of defending the tradition of immigration in this country set the scene for what followed post-2016.
And it's nice of him to conceive of the notion that not every problem in British politics began the day Corbyn became leader. But Miliband, really? Of all the people? Not Blair, not the Labour establishment who were pressuring Miliband to move the party to the right. And the immigration argument cuts right to the core of the supermod problem. Why had the freedom of movement argument been lost? You can see the right-wing Labour establishment right up to the leadership election in 2015, triangulating between liberal rhetoric, although heavily framed with neoliberal market logic, the kind of immigration is obviously good, it's nice to help people, but also it doesn't damage the economy, so we can do it. Obviously, we can't help people if it damages the economy. While at the same time employing conservative rhetoric about community identity, maybe people have come in too quickly, rather than actually Britain's not full, it's just the British government refuses to give local councils enough money to support the amount of people living there.
We've got to have a sensible debate about immigration, no arms race of rhetoric, because that just causes all kinds of problems and division.
We have not realised how quickly immigration has changed some communities in this country.
People are angry and concerned about immigration. They're angry about people trying to get into this country illegally, scrambling onto lorries from Calais.
If he sees people like me on the TV saying immigration's purely a good thing, well, no wonder he doesn't think that any politicians are relating their concerns.
And for people outside Europe, we need a strict point-based system like they have in Australia.
The government haven't got a clue. David Cameron has never been to Barking. If he came, they'd be warned in advance and everything would be brushed up. The government need to come and walk through our town and just see how we now live. Go back 12 years, it was totally different. Now, we are the complete minority there, and it's just like the most terrible place on earth to live at the moment.
1 in 7 new businesses are set up by immigrants, yeah?
To employ immigrants.
They've all been given money. Everything's been thrown at the immigrants. But listen...
No, I don't... David,
can I finish then? Listen, I've applied for 100 jobs in the railway. 100 jobs. I don't even get an interview no more. In the old days, at least you get a letter. At least you get a rejection letter. I don't even get that. 100 jobs. But these immigrants, they get all their tickets paid for. They get all their jobs. I'm homeless. I've got nowhere to live. I have to go down today and see an immigrant telling me that well, that's the truth. Well, that's the truth. I went down to John Smith's house today, and an immigrant tells me that I cannot live here. I cannot get nowhere to live.
All right. David Aronovich. Hang on. All right, let's hear... OK, we get your point.
You are... And we get nothing.
So you're blaming...
I'm not blaming immigrants at all.
No, you're blaming the wrong people.
I'm not...
You're blaming...
I'm just stating the facts.
Can I just say something?
Case.
No. You're stating a perception of the facts of the case, and I can
for me personally, and for many people like me.
Yeah, OK, you made your point. Let him answer.
I know, but just because you perceive something doesn't make it true.
It's true for me.
No. We can't walk through our streets because they're not ours anymore. Why is a street not yours? Because some of the faces in it are black. Why can't you be in a street that has white and black in it?
All right, you can answer this.
English on the streets.
No, hold on. Actually,
he didn't actually say...
Actually, most immigrants, of course...
He didn't say anything about black, and actually... He didn't mention black people. He just said immigrants.
Supermod. It is not often that a homeless man is given the opportunity to speak his mind on national television. But Aronovich decides to disregard the severe economic hardship the man is facing, to instead win easy applause by calling out his racism. Aronovich explains that he is blaming the wrong people, but he doesn't go on to say who in fact he should blame. And more crucially, he offers no counter-narrative. He doesn't mention any political action that the man could take to change his circumstances. The man, in fact, isn't really blaming anyone. He sees immigration as part of a systemic problem. The larger problem that he faces is quite clearly a lack of support and opportunity, which perhaps he does not want to admit even to himself, as I'm sure you know from your own experience. We live in a world where we are constantly pressured into believing that we are dependent on nothing and live by our wits alone. Either way, Aronovich has absolutely nothing to say about this. To discuss the decline in welfare, unionisation and housing and its effect on the sense of community and participation in society would for Aronovich be to concede that his own political views And columns of propaganda in the Times are, at least in part, where the real blame lies. What is most interesting about this exchange, though, is how there is just no awareness of how widespread, how serious, and how chilling this disenfranchisement and anger is. This guy's just a crazy racist. His views don't matter, and they never will. The exchange in many ways foreshadows the national and nationalistic anger that would be channeled through, while at the same time exploited by, Brexiteers. And this completely insufficient, often deliberately reductive and dismissive response by Aronovich pretty much sums up the establishment's response to Brexit. And by Brexit here, I don't mean the politicians or the Brexit agreement. I mean the millions and millions of people who voted for it. All we ever seem to get is a right-wing narrative that deflects systemic problems onto a supposedly destabilising external force, the immigrant, the other, and then the faux left supermod reaction, which is to ignore the systemic problems altogether in order to tell people to shut up and stop being so racist. I was reminded of Aronovich when I read an article by David Graeber that came out just after the 2019 election. Most sitting Labour MPs had begun as Labour youth activists themselves, just as most centrist political journalists had begun their careers as leftists, even revolutionaries of one sort or another. But they had also risen through the ranks of Blair's machine at a time when advancement was largely based on willingness to sacrifice one's youthful ideals. They had become the very people they would have once despised as sellouts. Insofar as they dreamed of anything now, it was of finding some British equivalent of Barack Obama, a leader who looked and acted so much like a visionary, who had so perfected the gestures and intonations that it never occurred to anyone to ask what that vision actually was, since the vision was precisely not to have a vision. Suddenly, they found themselves saddled with a scruffy, teetotaling vegan who said exactly what he really thought and inspired a new generation of activists to dream of changing the world. If those activists were not naive, if this man was not unelectable, the centrists' entire lives had been a lie. They hadn't really accepted reality at all. They really were just sellouts. Jones also asked O'Brien about Corbyn.
Yes.
Do you think if you had a choice, you'd have preferred that to this? And do you think a lot of people, a Jeremy Corbyn-led government
now?
Yeah.
God, what a tough question. Would you have preferred a Corbyn government to this? Brian, he's just not sure.
Do you think less time could have been spent maybe focus? Because there was a lot of fire focused, obviously, on his leadership. I'm not saying some of it wasn't clearly deserved. But do you think it was too much, and actually that allowed a kind of, for Boris Johnson, given most of the media back him, the few non-conservative elements of the media.
We probably had similar experiences here, but from different ends of the same telescope. Because for me, a lot of the focus was abuse being directed at so-called centrists. The idea that if you found Jeremy Corbyn anything other than messianic in his gifts, then you might as well, join the Tories.
You mean exactly the way that you behaved about Starmer in that clip?
Who would I rather have in charge now? That, for me, is the same question as it was back in December of 2019. They're both going to be absolutely awful. And here we are, one of them is, and the people who support the fellow who didn't win can pretend that he wouldn't have been awful, but he would. He would have been absolutely shockingly bad.
Why? What evidence? Why would he have been shocking? It was just self-evident. You going to back that up with anything? No. He was just awful. Really, really great critique. You should have your own radio show where you challenge people to back up their arguments, because you clearly are the sort of guy that knows how facile it is to just throw out strong opinions without any real evidence or even argument.
The financial support for people, I don't see that could have been improved upon.
Supermod.
I don't think you'd have had that 3 million hung out to dry.
Oh, so it would have been improved on, only slightly, only 3 million people, many of whom are using food banks at the moment, but who cares about them?
You might have had more support coming through Social Security than coming through a kind of bespoke furlough scheme.
Oh, and that's not a massive difference. A secure welfare programme that you can rely upon, rather than going through your employer. Many people that started out on furlough have since lost their jobs and are now on unemployment benefit. But tomato, tomato, right? I mean, Corbyn's awful, so how can you argue with that?
Listen, I don't enjoy this. I still take more shit from Jeremy Corbyn's fan club than I do from Nigel Farage's. So it's not.
Well, maybe that's something to think about, yeah, going forward.
Why, there are no children here at the 4-H club either. Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
It's not pleasant for me to still sustain this belief, but I thought he was so appallingly bad.
That's great. That's quality content right there. Then on Corbyn's popularity, he gives this amazing, almost Derrida-esque, complete opposite critique to any other critique of Corbyn.
I thought he was so appallingly bad, and I know that really upsets people, and I know why. I've given it a lot of thought, and Jeremy Corbyn was an empty vessel into which everybody poured whatever they wanted to pour, and that includes really beautiful, idealistic people who desperately want a better world.
Materialist, not idealistic.
They thought he was their man, and it also includes, kind of latter-day McCarthyists who thought he was Mao Zedong in a Pringle jumper, and because he didn't have much concrete ideology when he came to the fore, people poured into him whatever it was that they wanted him to become, and they still do.
He just didn't believe in anything. That was the problem with Corbyn. It's just the most bizarre take I've ever heard.
Now, I don't want to get bogged down in Jeremy Corbyn because of the things he's doing.
I mean, Jones must be thinking that O'Brien's out of his mind at this point. But as he says, he doesn't want to get bogged down in Corbyn, unfortunately. I mean, that's the interview that I would have liked to have seen. Owen Jones, a bit of feedback there from a viewer. But he does at least push back on this quite incredible notion.
That kind of sense of an empty vessel, I found an odd critique, because often people's critique of him is that he kept to his very dearly held beliefs for 4 decades and didn't change them. That was generally the argument that was put against him. He did have a clear set of the rich should pay more tax, utilities should be publicly owned, students shouldn't pay debt. I mean, those are, red lines for him. He wouldn't cross them ever. It doesn't matter.
They're not policies, are they?
No, they're not supermod policies.
They're really, really woolly principles. They're beautiful principles, which I share. But selling that, it's all right. If you don't like the empty vessel analysis, I could have fallen in behind Jeremy Corbyn if he'd taken the fight to the enemy.
If you don't like the empty vessel analysis, I've got others. So basically, O'Brien just completely gives up on that idea.
I've given it a lot of thought. I want a Labour leader, and I'm not seeing it now, by the way.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, I'm in the studios, not just mine, although, I'm still waiting for a response to my request for interview of Jeremy Corbyn that started in 2015. And he pulled out a Newsnight when he found out it was me presenting it. So, I've got personal issues there, but let's not get self-indulgent.
No, let's not get self-indulgent.
Well, if he's not going to talk to me, who the flip is he going to talk to, for goodness sake? And that was the problem.
If you're not going to talk to me, I'm great at talking. I've got a radio show. I talk to people all the time. I shout at them and then I hang up.
Well, James O'Brien, author of How to Be Right Wing, I'm going to hazard a guess that absolutely minted journalists with valuable London property aren't Labour's target vote when it comes to a socialist message. Just a thought.
Because I want to see a Labour leader who takes the fight to the enemy without and just forgets until they're in power about the enemy within.
But wasn't that the problem, I suppose, he would feel, a lot of people around him would feel they wanted to do that, but their own side wasn't focusing on the enemy without. It was actually Labour MPs or centre-left commentators would spend more time focusing on the Labour leadership than they would on the Conservatives.
I mean, if anything, he should have been laying into his own PLP. He should have brought in open selection. The fact that O'Brien believes that Corbyn was waging a war internally in the party, when Corbyn was trying everything he could to avoid that, makes you wonder what O'Brien's opinion would be if Corbyn had actually engaged in that fight, had actually removed the whip, suspended MPs, the way Starmer's doing.
There was no earthly way, apart from that one little window in 2017 when, for all your perfectly valid observations about trying to hold together a coalition, the chance of winning power came once.
There was no earthly way Corbyn could win, except that one time when he could have won. But apart from that, there was no earthly way.
And it was a vanishingly small moment.
To be fair, I haven't actually looked up what O'Brien's position was in 2016, 2017, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say he probably had a very similar position to now. He thought, there's no earthly way Corbyn could win an election. And then he almost does win an election. And then immediately afterwards, well, there's no earthly way he could ever come close again. There's no way this country would ever go into lockdown. There's no way this country would ever go into lockdown again. There's no way Keir Starmer could ever challenge Boris Johnson on coronavirus. What's amazing to me is since the 2008 crash, since Brexit, since Trump's election, since the pandemic, we live in a world where science apparently can change in a matter of days. And yet there's one thing that will always be true, and that's Labour have to win over swing voters in Nuneaton to get power. That's the one truth on which the entire universe is based. That can never change.
You know, when people would say, who would you put in charge instead? I'm not going to pretend it was easy to come up with somebody.
No, of course you can't. You can't imagine anything. You can't imagine anything except what has happened and what is happening.
I just didn't think he had a hope in hell of winning an election. Let's say because he was so nice, which I might not agree with, but if that helps people move on, he was too nice to win a knife fight. He didn't have a knife and he needed one.
That's some more classic supermod thinking right there. I don't actually have an argument. I don't really know why Corbyn couldn't have won, but I know that if I say that he was too nice, that might convince people or trick people into agreeing with me. I don't have an argument, but what I do have is a nice lie that I don't even believe myself, but hopefully you believe it, and then we can be friends again. If only O'Brien spent less time trying to prove that Jeremy Corbyn is unelectable, and spent more time thinking about why it is we live in a country where it's very difficult for someone like Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister and very easy for someone like Boris Johnson, and what part O'Brien himself might unintentionally be playing in all of this.
Keir Starmer, how's he doing?
Tough gig.
Tough gig. Oh, let's not be too harsh. Come on. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. Labour leader, you got to give him the benefit of the doubt, you know? There's the switch there between Corbyn and Starmer. It's like night and day.
Let you know, be under no illusions that you are watching a pandemic sweep through the nation.
And I guess there's an outside chance that O'Brien's huge sympathies towards Starmer are simply because we're dealing with a pandemic. Corbyn only had to deal with Brexit. I mean, piece of cake, right?
You're looking at tens of thousands of people dying, many of whom clearly avoidably, clearly as a result of Boris Johnson's policy. But he can't be seen, as you know, he can't be seen to want it to fail.
And there it is, the classic supermod position. He can't be seen to want it to fail.
And I don't think he's got it right, but you lose some weight in that criticism if you can't say what he should have done differently. I would have gone in very, very hard on the countries that are doing well. I'd have looked at them.
Yeah, if you had looked into it, you would have found that the countries that have dealt with this the best have implemented what would widely be described as socialist policies.
Should we do a quick rousing chorus of the red flag before you jog on?
I'm sounding like a sociopath because I'm about to say the same thing about Starmer that I said about Corbyn. I think he needs sharper teeth. I just don't think he's too civilised.
I know the sort of politician you'd like. Someone with a bit of backbone, yeah? Someone like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. A strong man, yeah?
Why do you think Labour are now struggling as badly as they are? I know people will say, well, that's because they're dealing with the Corbyn legacy. But actually, they're back to where the polling was under Jeremy Corbyn between June 2017 and December and January 2019, which is level pegging. So why are they? What reason do you think there is?
I don't think Starmer has inspired people. You know, if we were talking objectively.
Inspiring, yeah, that's what we need. If only Labour had an inspiring leader. Maybe O'Brien is saying that Starmer is too much of a full vessel.
if I try to imagine what it would be like to be in the shoes of someone whose vote was swayable, and we always underestimate how small I think that constituency is, I would feel uncomfortable attacking the government while the virus is still rampaging through the population.
Well, they didn't in America. It'll be interesting to see if many of the incumbent governments around Europe are voted out in the next general election, but Boris Johnson isn't. As well as looking at countries that have had a better pandemic response than the UK, why don't you look at countries whose political opposition has also had a better response? We're back to supermod thinking. The position we find ourselves in now politically, the arguments, the narratives that are dominant, are at least in part due to Starmer's decisions. If Starmer had become leader all guns blazing, with, I don't know, why not a zero COVID policy? Or at least a well thought through containment strategy. Or, I don't know, why not have 6 tests, 6 bullet points that they want the government to move on? For example, paying people to self-isolate, closing the borders, and quarantining. And stuck to these demands, week in, week out. So the public had an alternative idea of how this pandemic could have been fought against, how the extraordinary death toll could have been avoided. Then maybe people wouldn't be looking at Johnson and saying, well, he's doing the best he can. I don't see any other way around this. I don't know what more he could do. But no, Starmer's been almost as all over the place as Johnson himself.
Should we do a quick rousing chorus of the red flag before you jog on?
Get on with it.
Imagine a world in which James O'Brien actually listened to his callers. Instead of shouting at them, he tried engaging with them in an attempt to understand where they're coming from. Instead of looking for inconsistencies in order to destroy their argument, he looked for consistencies to help explain their argument. He worked with them rather than against them. Brexit and Corbyn's Labour leadership have been the 2 biggest forces in UK politics over the last 5 years, and both are a reaction to a crisis in capitalism and democracy that O'Brien appears to not even be aware of. By dismissing both as simply bad, O'Brien sees himself at the centre of UK politics, holding the fort of liberal democracy and progressive ideals. But those democratic processes have long since ceased to function, and those progressive ideals are undermined by massive inequality and systemic corruption baked in to the very institutions and networks of power that he believes are the only legitimate forces for political change. O'Brien has no insights and no ideas when it comes to these problems. Instead, he has spent the last 5 years worrying about dark advertising on Facebook and anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He mistakes uninterest for disinterest, and far from being at the centre, he is entirely outside the conversation.
They saw it in an age when the mainstream of political parties had sort of become a monopoly simple system in which there were no alternatives. They saw it as the only way they could register their anger, which is a sophisticated reading. And maybe they were far more sophisticated than we think. And for the last 4 years, those who were so angry with this refused to actually face up to that question of why did they do it? Instead, they're either stupid or they have been manipulated, which of course you would never be manipulated.
Yeah, exactly. Like, no, I'm not the object of propaganda. I can't be propagandized to. No one even bothers to, because I'm smart. I'm of the group of people that doesn't fall for that kind of thing. Well, I mean, if you believe that, chances are you're absolutely the victim of propaganda.
You're back to a sort of class distinction here between those who can be manipulated, who are not you, and those who can't be manipulated, who are you. And I just think that's quite a dangerous line to start drawing.
Well, I've got nowhere to live. I need to go and find somewhere to live.
All right.
Yeah, I will. Tonight.
Okay. You sat at the very back there. Thank you very much. You sat at the back.